Welcome everyone to YouTube Masterclass. This is a class that's taken at Harvard, USC, and Calarts, where I'm a professor for Coursera. Coursera, if you don't know, is a remote online service that offers you classes towards a major of your choice, aka philosophy or business or pre-med school, and depending on what your objective is towards a degree, that's then put into process towards your degree. And this can be an elective, or if we build enough of these classes and have enough film classes for even Harvard, we can turn these into degree type classes. Like, you could say that the 300 level and 400 level are really reserved for film students, but at Coursera you can study film and be a film student just through the remote practice of the online master's class that is promoted by YouTube mainly, but that Coursera agrees to transfer the credits by taking the final and watching all the video footage. Then Coursera will then give you credit at either USC, Calarts, or Harvard. Now, Harvard's the tricky one because they don't quite have a major yet, and I've got to teach an awful lot more masterclass before Harvard takes a full film school credit. But like, say you're at USC and you needed 4 credits and you were a junior or a senior, you could take these classes and really add it to your list of classes you needed out of the way. And these are hard classes. This is an Auteur of D.W.Griffith class. There's a lot to talk about today, and it's really intense, and I don't know really how to begin this, but we've been sitting here saying over and over that D.W.Griffith's Birth of a Nation and Edwin S. Porter's Great Train Robbery and Intolerance basically established the way the language of filmmaking is used. I don't quite see that. I see that with a Great Train Robbery, where you have a conflict resolution. You have a straight linear plot, but then it's parallel between the dance party and the train getting robbed. I can see the nature of practical editing that comes with the Great Train Robbery. Sometimes when I'm watching Birth of a Nation, I see how intricate the editing must have been for some of those close-up, far-away shots, like in the hospital, when you see him way back in the crowd and then you see him close up at the face. Some of these are such technical shots that's why they become a staple of media choices that a director can make in his own career to use emphatic and emphasis on their projects. And I think a Griffith touch is good. I think as we can separate that from the boundaries of racism and how a lot of that plays into Griffith cinema in Broken Blossoms and Birth of the Nation, for example. But we can see how it works in reverse ways too in Abraham Lincoln, not so much in America by D.W. Griffith, a Revolutionary War film that we can get to now or later, but it's about how decadent the forefathers were and how they won the war by strength, will, and supervision of a superhero kind. Now, there's a Griffith movie or a Chaplin movie. No, it's a Griffith movie, I think, called Lady of the Pavements. And I think it's Norma Talmadge playing a homeless person. And it's like one of those movies that's like really sad. And it makes you sad. And she's like homeless and nothing good comes of it. Like, occasionally she smiles. Lady of the Pavements. And it's really like, I don't think that it's Fairbanks and Pickford, but Fairbanks did do one for Griffith, and it's Talmadge, Norma Talmadge, that did the part. And she was one of the pioneers of feminist cinema in the silent era. So now we have the silent era established, and we see how the match-on movement and the match-on shape and the 180-degree line and the shot reverse shot and the everything that goes with classical Hollywood cinema does come with Birth of a Nation. And Tolerance, not so much. That's more of a modernist film. He drew so much attention to the fact that he was making a film that it becomes this expression, this self-reflexive, like, wild world of, like, where he wants to take us next. Wherever the edit falls, we go back to the other story at some point in it that might be random, might be apparently connected to the previous other flashback you see in some thematic way, but it's not your typical editing job. I mean, it looks like the editing job of Magnolia or something, Intolerance. Because in Magnolia, they pace it out, and they have, like, each plot coming back and forth. And then you have another one that's like that called Cloud Atlas. And Cloud Atlas is playing like 10 stories at once within 10 stories. You know? This movie is a Martin Scorsese film called Gangs of New York, and we have to attribute it almost to the ideals of Martin Scorsese being a very big D.W.Griffith fan. Martin Scorsese once said that when he saw Birth of a Nation, he saw it was like it became his favorite movie, like it was his favorite movie ever. And this one really plays out how that happens, because in time, the epic that's taken support from the prior epic all gets traced back to Birth of a Nation, or Intolerance, depending on if it's classical or modern. Classical seems to go better with the ideals of gangster films, and in a modern way, they're able to contribute like a period piece to when New York was being shaped as a city, and there were different gang factions. And it's got Daniel Day-Lewis and Leonardo DiCaprio and Cameron Diaz. And I think what's wild about it is there are other movies besides Gangs of New York that portray like the sensibility of a period piece and a gangster film. And I think Daniel Day-Lewis is in one of them, There Will Be Blood, which Paul Thomas Anderson is a really big Martin Scorsese fan. So There Will Be Blood is a year after the Gangs of New York. And I'm thinking there's a pipeline of oil that needs to open up. He has to pretend to be a Christian and get rid of his son who's got deaf ears from a blast of an oil well. I mean, this is a really intense movie. And so is Gangs of New York. Like every scene they're fighting, every scene they're like getting on one another. But you cannot help but realize the close-ups and the establishing shots and the scenes in between that make up the sequence and how it all links together from sequence to entire film. Gangs of New York's like 3 hours in length. Birth of a Nation's 3 hours in length. Gangs of New York uses multiple characters to play period piece characters, vintage of the time they were set in. Same with Birth of a Nation. That there's a female love triangle, similar to Birth of a Nation. Some of that got edited out. The Birth of a Nation led directly to this, like, Gone with the Wind type of filmmaking, which led to the Ben-Hur type, which led to the Heaven's Gate type films, and then you get to the next part up, and that's Gangs of New York, and you're like, in Gangs of New York, this is the elevated level of where we've come since Birth of a Nation. Like, it's got a total hint of irony pointed towards the Birth of a Nation, and I think that's one of the reasons Scorsese loves cinema so much, is finding the language of directors and then using it to direct the language of his own film. Because he has his own language for film. We've all seen his long takes, his tracking shots, his rack shots, his crane shots. Like in The Last Waltz, I couldn't believe how many crane shots there were. It was just mind-boggling. And so we've come to this point where, in a classical, neoclassical sense, we've been using Gangs of New York all this time to promote the movie Birth of a Nation and cinema in general, because we're seeing that there's a lot of interplay between how the films are made. There's all these behind-the-scenes type things about the war, not just violence, but behind the scenes of the war, where there's like, I don't want to use the word, but there's like trafficking, and they're really violent in this movie, and Scorsese gets a little more violent than Birth of a Nation, but this one's not a Civil War movie per se, except the establishment of New York wouldn't have been the same if it hadn't have been established by one of the gangs that wins in here. And I'm not going to really give too many spoilers away, but you've got to check it out if you're in the mood to check out a film that's neoclassical, in the sense that it's brought up to the modern times, in the sense that Gangs of New York is a lot like Birth of a Nation. In fact, saying so, at the end of this movie, towards the final battle between Leonardo DiCaprio, and frickin' Daniel Day-Lewis have this battle at the end. I don't want to tell you too much, but the whole sequence plays out like Battleship Potemkin, like when they bomb the Opera House. When the Potemkin bombs the Opera House after seeing it's another Potemkin that was trying to imitate them. I mean, Potemkin is all over the map with language, and Griffith boils down the basic essentials of all of Eisenstein and totally captures it in his own mind, that is already becoming like pulled towards the communist type vein of being an American, but at that time they didn't really have any problem with it. But let's look at something else here, because I'm like interested in D.W.Griffith all the way out. Like, we can look at his style, we can look at films that were influenced by it. We can also look at a series of films that I have basically laid out, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We still have plenty of time in the class, so get comfy. But we won't make it through all of these, and I brought some movies out to compare and contrast to Intolerance or Birth of a Nation, or both, or even the rest. That we compare and contrast Griffith and his films, as we've seen his filmography run up to Lady of the Pavements and then go on to The Struggle and the Abraham Lincoln movie, The Struggle being the last one, and then him going to war, World War II, and then him going to jail for being a communist, and then that's it. I mean, he just stayed in jail. He met Ed Wood when they formed the Directors Guild in honor of him, and he was already out of the business for so long. But they did respect Griffith in that sense. And I think Griffith's been around all through the whole meaning of the Kubrick thing, where he's saying Griffith needs to spend more, like, that he's like Icarus, and that if he flies too high, his wings will melt, but he just needs to spend more time on the wings. You know how Stanley Kubrick puts that. Well, let's go to another thought and say, well, maybe Griffith was more over-determined in his period than we realize, and actually that style of filmmaking was coming too in other surrounding short films and films that are linked within. And I think if you look at the chain reaction of a movie like Birth of a Nation and tell Ben-Hur in 1925, and then Ben-Hur in 1950s, you get this sense that there's still this Cecil B. DeMille Griffith spirit to every, like, epic that goes so epic that it flies off the charts. And I think that these films that are made classically but modernistically are big. They're wild, they're Braveheart, you know. But you just got to realize that whole adventure action, big epic genre period piece was constructed Birth of a Nation. And that's why they gave it the first American film rating, because it was the first one that held interest in the fact that the films are no longer biodegradable material. We have to hang on to them and see if they're still good. Now, I'm glad they hung on to this film, Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard. I have to challenge you now to think, we're in France in 1959. It's the debut of the Cannes Film Festival. Really, these guys that work at Cahiers du Cinema on the right bank, and Godard and Truffaut, those guys, and then the left bank was like, I don't know if Louis Malle was on the left bank, but André Renes was on the left bank, and they wrote for Positive. Now, I wanna write a journal for Cahiers du Cinema, but I don't do very good French. But this is Godard, okay? The same Godard that just died a few years ago. The same Godard that made In Praise of Love that it was so controversial. Hail Mary going back. Then we're into like the Tout va bien stage. And then going back we get to Weekend. And then it flashes back to Breathless. And Breathless, that was a flashback all the way through Godard's career back to Breathless, the debut film. Yeah, I like 400 Blows too. We got 400 Blows on the shelves over here. I mean, like, 400 Blows is amazing, where Antoine Renaud is in jail, and he's a little kid, and he has to keep quiet, and he's like trying not to cry, but he's also stuck in there for a long time, and he's like planning to get out, like in A Man Escaped, but he's like wormed in a hole. That's the end of 400 Blows, right before it freeze frames, right when he gets to the beach. And I'm like, a freeze frame as an ending? That's brilliant, because then you just focus on the last picture that was shown to you, and that's why 400 Blows is such a great Truffaut debut of filmmaking. But this is Jean-Luc Godard is the breathtaking master of Breathless. And as I know, John Paul Belmondo is the main character in this, like in Pierre Le Fou. John Paul Belmondo smokes a lot. He drives a lot. He brings his girlfriend with him wherever he goes. She's kind of a up-to-date, modern woman. And this is a modern film. And why I bring this up in Griffith class is because this is the distinction of what we have now with these new waves in these truly modern cinemas, is a breakaway from the traditional narrative of the form of editing, structure, style, and film language. And so now we're thinking we've had the Griffith wave for like 1958 years. And then like North by Northwest comes out and everybody's like, whoa, this is kind of a different effect. But that was the same year that Breathless came out, and if Breathless is rearing its head at the cinema and saying, look, this is the style of filmmaking that's from a basically like textbook directing. And another one that's a textbook director from this era is Psycho by Hitchcock. Because after North by Northwest, he took a less of a budget and made Psycho. And it's like an art film because she gets there's like one hotel setting, one office setting, one hotel room setting, one church setting, you know. The house has an outdoor setting where the car is pushed in. There's a whole highway setting that's at different points. And you're thinking with all these, it's modern because it's showing this like kind of arranged space where you're just traveling forward until you're destroyed, and then your money travels forward until it's destroyed. Then the monster's there. He has to face himself and the rest of who's coming. The monster killers are coming. And then you're thinking that this is the ultimate reason that Night of the Living Dead and other movies used that kind of style of filmmaking, which was very modern and full of shock cuts, which is where there's an attraction right as it cuts on, and then there's an attraction when it cuts off, and an attraction when it cuts off, and an attraction when it cuts on. That's really the Spielberg style. Cinema of shockwaves. It's like Orson Welles, you put something moving first when you go into the shot. Then you edit on that movement, and then you edit on that movement, and you press on, and then it's something big also at the end, and that's a shot cut all the way across. And I like those, like Orson Welles does them. Oliver Stone kind of does those, except he does these like jump cuts that are random, like more like Breathless, where it cuts away from the whole decoupage of the movie. Seems a little interesting because when you film a movie that uses a scene that's non-diegetic or not part of the main story of the film, you wonder where the image came from and what it's supposed to suggest that we as filmmakers look at and believe in. And then you go into this whole discussion that I had with a student, and we're talking about Birth of a Nation and how it pushes it to the absolute threshold, but still uses such a classical suture Tudor code, and that just means it teaches you that there's no whole gaps in the story. Even though I still hold some of the scenes with Silas Lynch in a bad way, and those scenes bother me really now because my moral conscience is saying Silas Lynch was made purposely to be like a villain, like he was made to be a villain. And I'm okay with making strong villains and story building and everything, but you got to have it kind of like within grounds of like what's going to be accepted as typical human life in the coming years is probably not Griffith's to decide. But that is establishing this kind of racist utopia is already bothersome to the field critic. That this film isn't really a rebellion against Birth of a Nation, but it's a total way to make a film without using Birth of a Nation rules. This film uses long takes, jump cuts, non-diegetic edits, music that's cued at any time at once and every time at once, a long tracking shot down a car lane, a beautiful woman in the process up in a hotel. These are set pieces too, but they're used in a Godardian way, and that's why I'm saying Psycho is brilliant in that Godardian way. And you cut it through the technical scenes, and what you have is a mastery of the cinematic form that's breaking away from Griffith, because it's not even questioning that Griffith had the only film language. In fact, they were probably really short on their film history, even by 1959, when things had settled with Kenneth Anger and Henry Langlois at the Cinémathèque in France. It seems like just about that time they blew the doors down with Breathless. And so I'm thinking, were they intentionally going out of their way to not use rules that were Hollywood-like, that were the standard mode of representation by Griffith is now fizzled by Godard, who's saying, maybe I'll do a Griffith movie someday, but this is not it. And none of his films really were. I mean, Pierre LeFou had kind of a Musketeers of Pig Alley is the closest one, of a Griffith film to be like even remotely Godardian. And then even then, it's not. It is on that level since they push themselves forward, inventing the close-up and all. But I'm telling you, Breathless is a style of filmmaking that actually gives us breath because we can go outside of the film, determine what we're objectifying, and then move on because we want to see the artistic nature of freedom. Freedom is, it hails down a lane to a hotel, and this time nothing bad happens. Really, except for people get existential and question existentialism at a coffee shop. I mean, this is not something I don't want to recommend. If you're a film student and you wonder what's not like a Griffith film in terms of cinema, Godard's Breathless is a lot more like, you could even say, Battleship Potemkin, in the sense that it's still, things are going wrong, but it's still accepted as the home sweet home, this country of France. And I had some other films shuffled out. I had a couple others that I wanted to discuss today and how it relates to Birth of a Nation or Intolerance. Now, these films, Gangs of New York's like spot on to the Birth of a Nation, like sweep, scope, massive reversals of fortune, as they said about The Patriot. That's what I'm saying about Gangs of New York, and like the style being Griffith's isn't defending Scorsese, because Scorsese can already find all this like intricate style and design in The Birth of a Nation. But now we have Godard who's saying we don't need any rules, or are we breaking them on purpose, or both, or is this just how it was shot and it just looks different? And that's kind of true too, that it's justified by pen, but on paper it looks pretty good too. And then you're talking about a French movie that came out before that, and you're saying, well, why the heck would I jump to this? And I'm saying because this is going to be an interesting film, like Lady Windermere's Fan by Ernst Lubitsch. This is The Earrings of Madame D by Max O'Fool. Now, Max O'Fool is known for his long takes, as Scorsese is known for his long takes, and P.T. Anderson is known for long takes, but Godard does a lot more jump cuts, although there is a 7-minute long take in Weekend by Godard where the car has to go through a traffic jam that has the main characters, and it's a long shot. It's all in one shot, too, and cars are going the other way. They're all spread out. It's a wild day at the Weekend. But what is up with the Earrings of Madame D? What's the draw to this film? I mean, apart from being slightly feminist, on the grounds of feminist, although the woman is objectified, we see this point that Max O'Fool is creating the decadence, but the earrings were the most decadent part because they keep getting stolen. And like in Trouble in Paradise, there's these thieves that run around and steal. And Earrings of Madame D has that kind of too. And I've read some stories that were like these stories where the people come to know each other, even though they're all switching off on the same earrings and kind of know it. Some guy's giving a girl it, she gets them stolen by someone else who gives it to a girl, who gives it to a guy, and he gets it stolen. It passes along. And what's really the motif in The Smoking Gun are the Earrings of Madame D. Now, when we look at D.W.Griffith style, this is about half and half with poetic realism. The poetic realism camp is like beyond even Impressionism, but kind of is Impressionism, and these earrings are the impression. But as far as D.W.Griffith goes, it's not much similar, except in how it produces Victorian-era restoration type. We're in the, this is the age of ascension, and we're all movie stars on the one hand, but that whole sense of like complexity with the lead character and the Queen Kelly and the Stroheim, Griffith really used Lillian Gish that way. And when Griffith used Lillian Gish as actress, we have to kind of say that that was the best acting performance of anyone's career ever. Not was she only was she the biggest star of all time, she was also the comptroller of all of Griffith's movies, including Birth of a Nation. And Lillian Gish always wanted to make them different and easier and wilder and harder. She had ideas that she'd just throw at Griffith, and she got to call the shots, even though she put up with a few things herself, mostly self-induced, as it all came to be. So the star turn of Lillian Gish is the most important one, because then you have other star turns after it. This isn't really using like what the star power of Hollywood would be, you'd think, but it kind of is. And with Griffith and Gish, it's like she became the moniker and movie head of the poster. And I can just picture her in Intolerance rocking that crib with that like nun outfit on. I'm just thinking how she came as like this poster, and then we'd all just believe it was Lillian Gish. And we see this whole demonstration all throughout Griffith's films about how Gish is leaning on her own sub-alluring fantasies to be dragged out in the world of wonder and not really know however to catch a context. Now, the poetic realism is saying, well, we're still using classical language like match on action, although that's going slow. Match on time, although that's going slow. Lots of long takes here. Match on, like, nuances, which is interchanges with, like, a Fouillard insert, where you see the small item here on their hand in close-up, and then in far away they're kind of holding it here, you know? Close-ups, and that it shows a style of filmmaking, you know, that goes to Children of Paradise and Marcel Carne, and goes back to Abel Gance with some of his films like Napoleon and La Rue. But the earrings of Madame D especially punctuate the idea of the dream being lived by you and yourself as the most important dream. And this desire to desire reminds me of a feminist film, that in a way it is kind of a feminist film, and although Lillian Gish would have been more a proprietor of the whole project, as though she would have viewed over it cautiously, as she may still do from the Vineland in the sky. But it's like every time we get a female star turn or a female consideration of actress and all the important things about it, we must remember these pivotal moments in cinema history that were like, so how is it not like Griffith? Well, the long takes, the mature view of human sensibility and womanhood. It also achieves the beauty of tracking shots and long takes and pans and side filters and light filters. Light filters are good to keep track of, because that's a good way of softening the focus for everyone. And this movie has a really soft focus all the way through, making it look delicate, making it look boyish, B-U-O-Y-I-S-H. Now, I don't really take it as offense that you haven't seen this, or maybe have, but the point I'm getting at is like a Lady Windermere's fans for like kind of a music piece, like Orpheus kind of, as the camera follows the characters, the music wages on these symbols like it. So this is all new sound film thing that has come in now that Birth of a Nation can't quite keep up with, and as that is the synecdoche and the symbolism, and that being audio too, of the impressions that are supposed to rely on a bigger thing, and the off-screen space and the use of Victorian. So the use of Victorian dress is Griffith, Birth of the Nation. But the star turn is also D.W.Griffith, Lillian Gish. But the editing style is long take dissolving into long take. And long take dissolving into long take is already going to make us kind of curious whether we really get much from Griffith in this. And there probably yes, because Max O'Fool is an epic filmmaker and all. Intolerance is the real epic film, like Cabiria, Italy's Cabiria. Speaking of Italy, so that's an interesting one to compare it to. So you'd say this one's nothing like Birth of a Nation, but this one kind of has some sensibilities with a period piece and disasters and theft and things like that seem like a modern crisp of Griffith's classicism, and that it's neoclassical already kind of points back to the Birth of a Nation style, except now this one is deep focus long take, and the deep focus long take is totally diametrical to the Hollywood take. The Hollywood take's like 5 seconds to a minute long, a minute being very long for a Hollywood take. A deep focus long take of like Orson Welles, though, as an independent filmmaker, or to like Alain Resnais, an independent French filmmaker, they use really long shots, really long, deep focus, long take. We get back to Paul Thomas Anderson and Martin Scorsese. Scorsese does deep focus, long take, but he also messes with montage, uses montage, and clarifies the reasoning through the montage, whereas the deep focus, long take can be the establishing shot, just the whole thing of it. But the deep focus, long take of, like, say, William Wyler's The Best Years of Our Lives, where this guy has a match on action and he's hanging up the phone in the back of the room. The camera slides further and shows him still hanging it up, and he comes back to the front of the frame. These are deep focus, long cuts that even David Bordwell was talking about in the history of film style, where it shows like how Birth of a Nation and Phantomos had all those similarities and differences that basically gave birth to the cinema. And Phantomos has some of those synecdoche moments of like someone carrying a drink, or someone like about to poison or maim someone. I mean, it's like a comic book movie with Fouillard, who's already at the Grand Guignol, where people are really getting lynched over plays and philosophy. And Fouillard and Griffith were competitive. I mean, they were both at like the type of Tin Pan Alley place where the film is disposable while you make it, but you still got to make the best one so that most people will come to your booth. And that's how you get to the Thomas Edison stage, which goes on and on and on as an underling of Thomas Edison. Not much is getting done except you're filming random ransacked movies. An elephant gets killed and Hollywood begins with the Humane Society and the Adventures of Dolly. And these are very concerning facts to us in the case of D.W.Griffith, and why it's important to study his eccentric nature with his controversial material. But the line of match between intolerance and other lines of filmmaking only matches Breathless in the sense of there's multiple narratives being parallel in the design of the montage at once. So you can see how Breathless is kind of like Intolerance, only that the design is there to be the time and space of the amount of shots that you need that are montage for the gripping parallel narratives. And parallel narratives in this one are all tracking forward, and they're all skipping around through time. And Intolerance, I think we see what we're talking about. With the Earrings of Madame D, I think that Max Ophuhl really extended the value of long takes. And I remember Paul Thomas Anderson discussing that on the DVD information of Boogie Nights, where he said Max Ophuhl is one of those long take, deep focus type guys, where the deep focus goes all the way to the back, and the long take is one that's continuing on and on. And we know what a long take is in this class, because a long take is the class itself, which is already on for so long, and it's still got a ways to go. And so that gives us time to discuss some other films. I find that if we discuss some of the later films to come out as like some of our own almost contemporaries, we have movies to look at. This one, particularly Fallen Angels by Wong Kar-wai, is a lot like Breathless, but it doesn't really have much D.W.Griffith influence over it. It's a Hong Kong film. You know, it's not like it's just suddenly taken out of print or in print because it's offensive. It's a gangster film from Hong Kong called Fallen Angels. And it's like Breathless in the jump cuts, and it's like it goes from black and white to color in beautiful ways, like Samuel Fuller ways. Like Samuel Fuller in Shot Corridor has all these guys in an asylum, and then has a dream in color, and then back to the black and white. I mean, that's Wizard of Oz style. This is Wizard of Oz Hong Kong style because it's beautiful. It's like they hit the road. They're gangsters, they're bandits, they're like, you know, they'll drink alcohol, they smoke weed. They have to do like the Tarantino thing and kill people. This movie was brought to attention to America by Tarantino, like with Chungking Express, which they're now Criterion hits. And Quentin Tarantino had this production company that was putting out these movies, and they were really good when they came out, and they made us all want to go back and watch Wong Kar-wai's other movies, like As Tears Go By, for instance, is a really good one. And Happy Together is a later film after this. And then we've got In the Mood for Love, establishing like what is today's cinema. And that's what we forget about In the Mood for Love and Fallen Angels, is there really are a rousing portrayal of cinema of today and how cinema of today functions. It's either an In the Mood for Love or it's a Fallen Angels. In the Mood for Love being like the Iliad and Fallen Angels being the Odyssey or vice versa, but they're Asian myths, so we really can't supplant those conditions, although some of those conditions are notably stitched through the narrative. And I think what's cool is you see even on the cover that there's these like shots from different angles, and the guy's looking down and the girl's looking in a different direction, and then there's these scenes that are in beautiful masterpiece, beautiful color, and it's like the DVDs will be turning on the rack on this, these CDs will be turning on the rack of this jukebox, and this lady dances near a jukebox. The beauty's spectacular, everybody looks good. Wong Kar-wai did Ashes of Time, that's another great one. And I recommend these movies a lot. The Fallen Angels is kind of one of those films that'll make you, once you watch it, you'll fall down on your knees and start worshiping the film gods. You'll just be like, the film gods have delivered, the film gods have seen what we've wanted, and hath come to deliver all. And that it's edgy and violent, well, Breathless isn't necessarily that. I know Band of Outsiders by Godard has a little bit of violence, but nothing compared to the Reservoir Dogs that was later kind of like Band of Outsiders, only in the sense that Band Apart is Tarantino's company, and Band of Outsiders is what that means in French, and that's a Godard film. And there's not much violence in Godard, except in Weekend there's a ton of violence, and there's usually one or two casualties per movie. Pierre LeFou has violence, I guess, yeah. So there are violence in Godard's movies, and we can see how his violence is an extract of what is not only offensive, but what is also not representative of the violence of the films of the early 20th century. And this film sets the standard for what films need to be like today, so along with In the Mood for Love and Ashes of Time, where they all demonstrate a style of filmmaking that's once again kind of like not really from Griffith, but definitely from Godard. This is definitely an extension, a modern extension of the Godardian narrative. So we see another one that if Birth of a Nation hadn't appeared, we still might consider it to be an all original language debuffer, but we can see how the pop culture of Hong Kong is represented in these films with guns, and you can see it as a montage that's like being as romantic and as gangster, which Breathless is kind of a gangster film. Technically, John Paul Belmondo's a gangster in it, so I can see where Breathless would really follow Fallen Angels to a contingency. That we still don't know necessarily if in Breathless he was intentionally going away from Birth of a Nation ideals and G.J. Spooky kind of hierarchies and G.J. Spooky's like levels of communication that are putting the African Americans back into the grave where they found them. It's a horrible experience with G.J. Spooky over to the Birth of a Nation, because he's basically bagging on the film as one big epic slavery needs to come back request. And I didn't quite see it that way. That's like saying these oppressive detective and gangster films aren't like Fouillade, which they're totally like Fouillade. And Breathless kind of has the Fouillade, but has more of the John Vigo to it, But the John Vigo cult would love Breathless in the way that they film natural sound and natural surroundings. But this film has all the different modifications you can use to an image, and it, like I said, it makes you fall on your knees and thank the cinema gods. And really, we're thanking Godard when we thank Wong Kar-wai, and we look back at what precedent that had, and then we see kind of Battleship Potemkin arising in the background there as kind of the montage film that taught the parallels of montage to all these great future montage films. And so you can see why Battleship Potemkin and Fallen Angels come from that line of reasoning of the filmmaking. That Griffith did adapt so much to Battleship Potemkin gives credit to both Battleship Potemkin and Griffith, who learned a lot from each other, Eisenstein and Griffith, and interchanged ideas a lot. And it's kind of where Griffith got his idea to go into communism, was from Eisenstein. Surprisingly, that was way back in the 20s, when things were just getting interesting in Hollywood. I'm sure that things are always interesting in Hollywood, though. I'm sure. I can't really tell you, but ever since Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks put up Pickfair and decided to have that mansion there, I mean, there's like the Playboy Mansion. I mean, there's legends of all the eccentricities that go on in Hollywood, and everybody wants that to be like the Player 2, or they want to make another Player just so they can see all. It's like Cecil B. Demented will get as fiery drunk as Sam Peckinpah or whatever. You know, it's like we go down every list and we're like, we'll get like racially incurred like Kenneth Anger and Spike Lee. You know, it's like, wow, this is a really combustible form of correcting, and that they're all kind of in debt to Griffith. They've all kind of developed their own style, whether he was there or not, in the kind of montage films. But now we see again, like with Gangs of New York, how it's using deep focus, long take, and montage too, but in a classical way where the montage and mise en scène coalesce. And it's like the mise en scène is shown for longer, the montage is shown for shorter. They kind of mix them together and use them as a breach of moving the movie along with match on action, match on shape. And you see the crowd scenes in Gangs of New York are really what's like the sword and sandal epics that Griffith wanted to make like in America of. And so when there's crowds and all the people are lost in the crowd and people are in their costumes all throughout the crowd, then you've got the Griffith paradigm. And that is where you're in that whole world of like associative disjunct with the fact that you're already suspending your disbelief to take you back in time to the place. Now you're trying to match a theme and set characteristics with the shorter editing montage filled throughout the mise en scène that's in long take, that takes in the surroundings in a Scorsese world of looking at things that way. The crowd shots being crowds everywhere throughout is a conscious character of Eisenstein again, where the crowd is a character in Strike. The crowd represents all in one character is like symbolic of the crowd. And there's that King Vidor film, The Crowd, and you just think of how, like, in that one he becomes one of the crowd, like he just kind of has his wife and kids and decides not to, go to Hollywood and throw it all away and see if he could gamble it on a dream or whatever and see if he was doing any good. But we're going to move on. I'm still discussing now, and I think I'll put that one away for now, but I'm still discussing movies that may or may not be defined by Griffith. And I mean, if we look at like the key movies like Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind of that era, and Birth of a Nation and Intolerance of like the silent era, and then in the 20s it was kind of like Sunrise and Jazz Singer or something, and then you've got Wizard of Oz, and these are the most important films. And Gone with the Wind. Now, Gone with the Wind is by far the total copy of Birth of a Nation. I mean, everything's the same except it's in color. It's in bigger filming. It's got the actors are in sound. It's a sound film now. The South doesn't win, but they get devastated. The Klan doesn't really get represented because there was kind of a production code law against representing anyone in a negative light, and they found that the Klan outfits for Gone with the Wind were too controversial in that setting. So they hinted at it in some other way. And that there's all these movies leading out from Birth of a Nation, and then it goes to like this kind of North by Northwest, and now we're resetting everything. But after Psycho and all that, back in Italy, we still have the work of Rossellini. Now Rossellini and all the other Italian directors like Fellini and Visconti and Vittorio De Sica were making movies that were like slowly progressing to more epic, more controversial, more upheaval, and more climactic. So they were, and that's why they would do the deep focus long take. Now this is nothing like a Griffith film because it totally focuses in these really long takes, like 10-minute takes. It's just them sitting eating with Louis XIV, taking of power by Louis XIV. It's a really hard Blu-ray DVD to track down. It's not the easiest, but one thing I'm going to say is that it makes sense to call the epic poem of, and the poetry for romantic poetry, like Earrings of Madame D, comes from the idea that we have this like soft, metaphorical, aestheticized, like a artistified kind of artifice itself. And the taking of power by Louis XIV is Rossellini. Now, Rossellini is the one that married Ingrid Bergman and made Stromboli, but more important, he made the War Trilogy with Germany, Open City, Paisan, did about the bipartisans eventually, and then Germany Year Zero. And we've gone over and over those films in Masterclass, left and right. I mean, we didn't cover any stone unturned with Rossellini, that he uses regular natural actors, natural light, natural surroundings, a lot of props, a lot of mise-en-scène, production design. There's a little bit of montage, but there's not a whole lot of edits in this movie. There's probably only like 50 to 58 edits in this movie, really. And it goes over almost an hour and a half. And that's really a lot longer than the average of a shot in a Hollywood film that is basically like the shot length of a Birth of a Nation type shot length. And this one is kind of like defying it by even more rowdy, controversial long takes. So the long takes now are getting to be not just like to create realism, like in, the movies we talked about. Long takes or create realism because they absorb the picture longer, Bazan says. They take the impression out of the airwaves and put it onto the film, and that's the whole theme. But the only thing that was like the Griffith was the taking of power by Louis XIV was a costume design. Now, one thing you've got to give Griffith for is he's got awesome costume design in Gangs of New York and period pieces like that, like Louis XIV. These big long shots that are taking imprints are also becoming metaphors of like parodies of themselves. Like the long take in Godard is just Godard saying, well, I never do long takes, so here comes a long take. And he's like, well, I never do long takes, but I'm going to do a long take, And in this, we've got impressions of how the movies play back on themselves as these kind of like tributes to like film history, as like records are broken on length of shot. And that also does a good job for the way that documentary works out in Bazan's way, and Bazan loves Rossellini, and Rossellini we love. And then you see an earlier one than that, and then we'll probably, I think I'm gonna like talk about this film a little bit and how it differs from Birth of a Nation. And really, if I wanted to look over at my collection, I could always see one that reminds me of Birth of a Nation, like Barbarella doesn't. But again, Barbarella has great costume design, and you've got to understand that even if you're against the politics of Birth of a Nation, DJ Spooky kind of makes the mise-en-scène look good in terms of the costume design, because the costume design is actually frightfully accurate. Now, if the costume designer is responsible for makeup and blackface, I'm sorry, that was the worst thing that happened in that film. Worst thing that happened in American history of film. But that their costumes actually looked like the real deal in Intolerance and in Birth of a Nation is kind of a reason all period pieces thereby after, like they would have with Cabaret anyway at that point, had modeled themselves after those films. And you can see that in Gone with the Wind. And then you go to the 60s where it's like the new two films are like Easy Rider and Hard Day's Night and shiznit like that. So you're like, okay, now we're seeing the cinema break free of its original ideals of Birth of a Nation, but it's still into freedom. And it's freedom from those rules. And whether they intentionally or non-intentionally do it, they go against the Griffith grain and Easy Rider. And it's not the reason they do it isn't because they don't like it. And they do use some of the kind of tracking shots and a montage sequence built cleverly in a graveyard at the end of Easy Rider. And it's this kind of modern way of re-breaking down the image, and Hard Day's Night kind of re-breaks it down the image in this thing that will become Easy Rider project that kind of turns into Nashville. And now we're really using sound at its full taxonomy, because now we have the sound really cranked and on different microphones that switch from viewer to viewer. But the last one I'm going to talk about in class, and we've got just enough time to talk about it before I let you go until next time. And just remember now, this is the 9th class of the semester. There are still 7 more come back and see what we have to say about D.W.Griffith and his films, whether they made any chance to meet any of these standards or not, whether the standard was raised, whether the standard was changed, whether film language evolved, whether like the extra cinematic affairs wanted more close-ups like in Easy Rider, wanted more rock and roll on the soundtrack like in Breathless by Godard with all the jazz music. I mean, Elevator to the Gallows is French New Wave by Louis Malle, but it's definitely got one of the most killer soundtracks that was made just for it by, I think, Miles Davis? Or Charlie Parker? Charlie Parker. So, I mean, now we're talking about these visual codes and these audio codes that are all being spread throughout a film, not haphazardly, but at a very intricate moment that's not the moment we expected. So, boom, we're self-reflexive. Boom, we're parodizing the shot we're seeing of it, because it's saying, this is a shot, here's what's in the shot. You just watch the shot, it's called This Is a Shot, and here's what's in the shot. It's a very interesting game to play, and it starts getting really echoey on the art film level. I'm telling you, there's some of those Matthew Barney movies where just like, wow, they've really taken that whole montage to a whole new head, and still played with Griffith scenarios with the classical editing. So you can see how classical editing is associated with the Birth of a Nation, and how it goes back to, that one goes back to the Great Train Robbery as being the climactic. And then Gone with the Wind gets climactic. And the one thing about Easy Rider is the ending in a graveyard is it gets climactic. So now it's not an apocalyptic finale or a last-minute rescue finale like Griffith would have. But in Easy Rider, you have the finish line, they made it, they feel bad, they're going home, they're going back on the road the other way, and it's like, what did they succeed in? Well, they brought the poetry of the world with them when they made it into a movie. It's like those guys expressed movie people that were coming with cameras, and that would express their whole freedom of taking it anywhere they wanted to, rather than some backcountry road hoisted full of like these Klansmen. And really in Easy Rider, the people that killed Jack Nicholson and all that, they seem to be these irrational, like, extinctionists that didn't want the modern character to exist, so they blew him off their motorcycle. The point is, the Klansmen weren't exactly the good or bad in Easy Rider. That I do remember maybe seeing a Confederate flag in it, we're not going to go into. I mean, I think flags are fine. Do what you want with the flag. Put a flag up. Take a flag down. Put whatever flag you want up. Take a flag down. I don't care what you do with your flags. Doesn't bother me none. Now, Umberto D is like the Bicycle Thief. It's Vittorio De Sica, and it's really the most memorable, besides Shoe Shine, of all the De Sica masterpieces and Bicycle Thief. And if you don't know the whole story behind De Sica, he was going, again, for the long takes that were deep focus, not like a Griffith story, and documentary realism with everyday actors and sound film that the sound is like a documentary. The sound taking of Power by Louis XIV is very quiet, and there's some like loud blasts of classical music, but in Umberto D you have mostly either him listening to the Italian radio. But now this is a film about an old man that takes his dog on a walk, and really all that happens in a film is he takes his dog on a walk, his dog escapes, and he goes looking for his dog eternally. And I don't think in the movie he even finds his dog later. Maybe it reunites with him at the end. I think it does. I mean, it's the only good thing to happen in the whole chain of events that's like unfortunate events. And he's not having the best day. He loses his dog. Everybody that's watching the film is crying that he's never going to find his dog. He's going to be abandoned to his old years and be set aside and be walked on, and nobody's really going to care about him anymore. Is the sad part, but that his dog is missing somewhere in Rome is really sad. And you think these long takes are really, they started with those long takes, I swear, in Paisan or something with Rossellini, where he's doing the battles with the bipartisans. The shots are starting to get longer even for an action film, and now they're absurdly exaggeratedly long. Like Antonioni will do a one in The Passenger in the 60s that's like an 11-minute deep focus long take that was one of the longest ever. You know, Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, the opening shot, was like a long take, deep focus, and was like 7 minutes long. This one has long shots, long takes like that, and maybe less edits than most movies too. Like the edits of Taking the Power by Louis XIV, which were sparse and very few of them. And the mise-en-scène collects in documentary form, that is, natural progression of the events, almost cinema verite, like we're finding out what direction this movie's going to go in. Just by watching it, you see it go in different directions, and you're not sure why it chooses to go down the mundane, overwrought, like stressed out path of these anxiety-ridden characters that are like normal people living in a world of post-war. And the post-war has to be, there has to be a restoration in the post-war period. And it reminds me of Germany Year Zero, when there's just a little kid walking around and he can't find his parents, anything. All the buildings in Berlin are blown up, just like they really were in real life. Very serious, very heartfelt programs. In this one, he thinks he's going and losing his mind, and then he loses his dog. And then he does lose his mind, and then at the last minute, his dog comes back. And I'm really happy that one thing happened in the whole history of cinema, and I'm not sure if it happens in every version, but it happened in the version I watched, and that is Umberto D. Umberto D. gets his dog back.